I'm delighted to be here. I'm coming to you from what we call the homeschool room in our house. Um, this was our base camp for the 8 years that my wife led the home education of our older son. He's since gone on to college and now to law school. So I have claimed it as my office, and I kind of chuckle when I think about it. It's a bit of a misnomer to call a room a homeschool room, because anyone who has educated their children at home knows that the world is their classroom when you homeschool, and you don't spend all that much time in any one place. Alex just spent a lot of time outside with the social network of families that were part of our homeschool community. Volunteering at the food pantry, in various field trips. Of course, he'd always have to write a paper. Whenever we traveled anywhere, and he kind of grumbled about that, but now he's filing legal briefs, so I think he appreciates the learning that took place. So, as Brad indicated, I'm a scholar of education policy, of school choice. I've studied homeschooling a bit, and of course, I've practiced it. So I was rather stunned when my alma mater, Harvard University, in their alumni magazine, featured an article about the law review article published by one of their professors, Professor Elizabeth Bartholet. And there was a graphic, that there was a picture that went with the article, and it showed a child inside a house with bars on the windows. Basically, this was a child being educated at home who was being imprisoned through the process of home education. And I was absolutely stunned, because whoever designed that graphic and agreed to publish it with the article obviously knew nothing about homeschooling, because homeschooling is nothing like that. But Professor Bartholet argued in her law review article, she made a lot of very strong claims about homeschooling. She claims that it's a new phenomena in the United States. She claims that parents who homeschool aren't interested in educating their children, which is kind of a curious charge to make, that they are mainly interested in isolating their children from the broader society, indoctrinating them in their own narrow set of cultural values, and abusing them, uh, free from interference by public officials. So these are some rather strong claims being made by people critical of homeschooling, and it led Professor Bartholet to argue there should be a presumptive ban on homeschooling. That is, no parent should be allowed to educate their child at home unless and until they have proven themselves innocent of these motivations, desires, and abusive practices. So, with that as the background, I'm going to make a few opening comments, and then start a colloquy with my good friend David Sikkink. When we look at the history of homeschooling in America, homeschooling was pretty much schooling in America during the colonial period, during the early years, decades of the Republic. Basically, children who were educated at home. Now, unfortunately, we didn't have universal education of children, but most children were educated, at least to the point of being able to read and write. And that education generally was provided by their parents, or by tutors arranged by their parents, or by some sort of organic cooperative within the community, which sort of developed into the one-room schoolhouse in many rural areas. This was all sort of both before and during the development of the public school system. Um, the common school system, which my good friend Charlie Glenn has written so compellingly about in his book, The Myth of the Common School, homeschooling remained a major element of education in the United States throughout the 18th century. Really, it wasn't until or I'm sorry, the 19th century. It really wasn't until the turn of the 20th century when government directed public education was the overwhelming way that students were educated in America, and it led Oregon to even go so far as to attempt to ban private schooling. In a famous case called Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the state of Oregon could not outlaw private schooling because the child is not the mere creature of the state. Very famous statement made about the fact that parents have both rights and responsibilities to educate their children, and that would include choosing private schooling for them and not necessarily being compelled to send them to the public schools. Now, in spite of that, homeschooling actually was outlawed by truancy laws in every state in the United States throughout the first half, the first really 2/3 of the 20th century. It wasn't until the 1960s that some states started permitting children to be educated at home and educated through parent-directed cooperatives. And eventually, every state instituted that reform through a period of about 25 years. And now home education is legal in every state in the United States, regulated to various degrees, but legal and very popular, as about 2.5% of students in the United States are educated at home. And of course, recently, almost every student in the United States was educated at home for a brief period. Not the way that homeschooling is desired to be delivered, but it did sort of give many parents a sense of what home education might be like, and there's an expectation that there will be more homeschooling in the future. So with that as a premise, I'm delighted to bring into the discussion my good friend David Sikkink. David is an esteemed professor of sociology at the University of Notre Dame and has conducted a great many survey studies and longitudinal studies of children involved in various forms of types of schooling. And particularly more recently has turned his attention to looking at the characteristics and practices of families who engage in home education. So David, to start us off here, let me ask you, how diverse is the homeschool population in terms of race, income, religion, family structure, and political ideology? A lot of critics sort of make the claim that this is a movement of white religious fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, and that the homeschooling population is really sort of monolithically politically conservative and Protestant. Is that really true?
Well, I think there's more diversity now than there was, say, in the 90s or early in the kind of modern homeschool movement. But now we have a weight towards more religious, but an incredible diversity among the homeschooling group as a whole. To the extent to which you can think of it as a homeschooling group, there's so much diversity within it. In terms of race and ethnicity, the latest 2016 National Center for Education Statistics National Household Education Survey showed that 41% were racial and ethnic minorities, and a large increase among Hispanics in the US. So right away, an amazing amount of diversity, really. And people are taking up homeschooling for a lot of different reasons. if we look at regional variation and urban, rural, there's quite a bit of diversity. It's more prevalent in rural areas, more prevalent in the South and the West, but a lot of homeschoolers in very different settings throughout the country. In terms of religion, it looks like, I mean, there are more more religious conservative religious homeschoolers, but it's not really what it's assumed to be. There's an incredible amount of diversity. So, for example, if you look at the percentage of homeschoolers that never attend religious services or attend only once or twice a year, you get about 39% of homeschoolers that are in that category. Now that's lower than the public schoolers, but still that's 40% that are not attending church, not attending religious services very often at all. Now you do get a higher percentage at the high end too, about 26%, I'm sorry, about 41% are in the once a week or more category of religious service attendance, which is higher than the public schoolers. But still, I think, there's quite a bit of diversity there, 40%, nearly 40% in the never, once or twice. Religious tradition as well, evangelical Protestant, about 43%. But then those with no religion, about 19% among homeschoolers. So these are, lower on the no religion side and higher on the evangelical Protestant side, but still a lot more diversity than is usually talked about. In terms of political party, it's pretty interesting, I think. And not surprisingly, there are more Republicans, there are fewer Democrats, but it's not as big a difference as you might expect, I think. It's in terms of Republican, it's about 30% Republican compared to 24% for the homeschoolers, or for the public schoolers. But what's interesting, I think, is you get more independence among the homeschoolers, 28% to 24%, and you get much more no preference among the homeschoolers, which I think is pretty telling. So the homeschoolers have about 28% that say they don't have a political preference, compared to 18% of the public schoolers. So I think a lot of diversity, a surprising amount, even in terms of religion, in terms of income, education, is pretty fascinating. Well, in terms of education of parents, it's about the same. There's not much difference. There's probably, again, quite a bifurcation there. Some very educated parents, some not. But overall, it's about the same as public school parents. In terms of income, it's lower, probably because somebody has to do the educating. So you're looking at one income families. So definitely lower income families are doing homeschooling. But it's hard to know what to make of that exactly, because usually the mom, about 80% of the time, the mom is staying home, is not working and educating the kids.
So, David, related to that point, how common is home education among single-parent families? It would seem like it would be much more difficult for a single parent to be delivering home education.
Yeah, the percentages were higher than I expected, and if we look at the married, those that are married, it's about 74% of homeschooling families are married. The parents are married, compared to about 69% for the public schoolers. So not a huge difference, but there is something going on there. If we run the regression and try and see what's happening, those families that are living together, cohabitating, those that are divorced, and those that have never married are less likely to homeschool. So there is a fairly strong effect that comes through in the regression models. The percentages I don't quite remember, but it was a fairly surprising, but small, but fairly surprising number of single parents that were homeschooling.
All right. So, Professor Bartholet, claimed that parents who homeschool aren't interested in educating their children. And as with the demographic data you just described, their levels of education tend to be similar to the population at large. So they're not necessarily far more educated than the typical parent. So what do we know? What do we know about the academic outcomes for students who are educated at home? I mean, they're not informal um, uh, institutional schools. They're not necessarily being taught by teachers with certification and things like that. So what do we know about their educational outcomes?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Again, there's a lot of diversity in the movement, and you start off with a group that's fairly skeptical, right, of the value of formal institutional approaches to education. So, whether this group would be any different on educational outcomes if they went to public school or not, it's a little bit hard to tell. But what I think of it as is that for the homeschoolers, they will get the education that they feel they need for what they need to do. So it's kind of like the Bill Gates approach. If I need to get some education about something, I'll get it. If I don't, I'm not going to get a credential just to get it. So overall, we will see, on average, lower levels of educational attainment among homeschooling families, but quite a bit of diversity too. A lot on the high school education, and a lot on the other end, on the college education. So overall, there's certainly some skepticism of the importance of the credential. Of course, many social ed scholars have talked about the credentialing effect of education. It's not so much the learning. So in a way, homeschoolers have taken on this skepticism of whether formal education and formal degrees are all that necessary. On the other hand, we do have some fairly clear evidence that those that do attend college tend to get better grades. So if they are compared to public schoolers, so they seem well prepared. They say that they feel well prepared for university, and grade-wise, they seem to be doing a little bit better even when they do go to college.
Great. I I have to laugh because going back to that graphic in the Harvard magazine, that showed the homeschool as prison, they had written on there the walls were made up of books, and one of them had arithmetic on the spine, but it was misspelled. And of course, every year, the National Script Spelling Bee champion is a homeschooled student. So, so, if anyone's going to misspell arithmetic, it's not going to be a home educated child.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
a house made out of books might be quite attractive to a homeschooled child, and that's not all bad.
Right, right. Which might reflect the fact that they do so well in college is because, under home education arrangements, typically the child is doing more reading, being more proactive in seeking out, the material for their education, and that could have positive spillover to the college level, where ideally, we do want young adults, to be very curious and to be very proactive in seeking out their material and education.
Yeah,
So
self-directed. Yeah, I think
yeah,
that's true.
so a big concern about home education, and again, I personally feel this is a myth about homeschooling, but it's a persistent myth out there, is that the experience is socially isolating for children, that they don't develop proper social skills because they aren't in an institutional school. Do we know anything about the social development of homeschooled kids?
Yeah, as much as we can see, we don't really see much difference in terms of, the kinds of friends or the extent of friends, the involvement in interpersonal relationships. Homeschooling versus public schooling, we really don't see much going on there. In terms of connections to minorities like atheists or racial and ethnic minorities, we don't see a difference. When they become young adults, it's about the same. And we know that the actual practice of homeschooling involves so many a very diverse engagement in different kinds of networks and organizations, that, as you said at the beginning, it makes homeschooling kind of a misnomer. A high percentage, at least 30%, and probably by the time it's all over, probably about 60% of homeschoolers will have been involved in some kind of co-op, some kind of homeschooling co-op and network. They're very active in getting out into the community, going to the libraries, going to the events and activities available in the community, because for most homeschoolers, the educational experience extends into the community. So there are a number of structures that connect the home to the outside world, give students opportunities to interact with other kids, and with other adults, through these more informal networks. And on top of that, many homeschoolers are doing some kind of hybrid model where they're getting some education at a college or a private school, a public school. These models are expanding really rapidly, and have been, I think, some of the more creative and dynamic, and perhaps have a lot of potential for improving education through these hybrid models of home and school. Uh,
Sure. Yeah, and I think another thing to keep in mind is that most homeschool kids experience institutionalized schooling at some point in their K-12 experience. That 10% of American students are homeschooled at some point in their K-12 experience. So that means that the modal homeschool student has experienced some mix of home education and education at a public or private school. And also, there were some very famous homeschooled people, in young people in the last couple decades. Tim Tebow comes to mind, the Heisman Trophy winning quarterback who vexed my Arkansas Razorbacks for so many years, and also the recent Grammy Award winner Billie Eilish is also homeschooled and comes from a homeschool family. So partly in response to that, we have new policies in most states that allow children being educated at home to participate in extracurriculars at their neighborhood public schools. So sports and theater and band and those kinds of activities, which again sort of creates more of a hybrid type of experience of homeschooling, and really shatters that myth about homeschooling imprisoning a child within their home.
yeah,
So what do we know? The strongest claims that these law professors who have criticized homeschooling have made, the strongest claims is that homeschooling perpetuates child abuse, and the reason they argue it does is because most staff of a institutional school, a public or a private school, are mandatory reporters of signs of physical or sexual abuse of children. And so if someone is in their home, if a child is in their home and educated in their home, they are removed from those mandatory reporters. And if the source of the abuse is in the home, that there's a danger that it goes undetected and unreported. What evidence is there that abuse is widespread in the homeschooling community?
Yeah, this, of course, it's a really hard claim to get any real hard data on. I mean, we don't really even know much about whether public school teachers are somehow more or less successful than other institutions or other informal networks that are able to find out about and report about child abuse. So there's a lot of assumptions that are baked into this, and we really don't have that kind of data. But what we do see is that homeschoolers are more likely to talk in their young adult years, to talk very favorably about their homeschool experience, to talk about uh, the um, the overall experience as being a very positive one, to be likely to say that their teachers were very caring. Now, of course, this isn't necessarily going to pick up on child abuse, which is a small percentage. But it is interesting to note that homeschoolers have very positive things to say about that experience, except for athletics. And that's not too surprising given the kind of money that public schools have put into athletic opportunities. But even that is changing. As you noted, a lot of homeschooling athletic leagues have grown up in recent years, and opportunities for homeschoolers to be involved in public school athletic activities as well. The other thing I would say about it is that, her case, Bartholet's case, is based on an assumption about structure, that if you have students who aren't in contact with public schools, then we have fewer people that are reporting, right? And if you have people, students who are in prison at their home, that therefore increases the power of the parent. Well, I mean, that kind of argument could apply to parenting in general, right? So it's not very helpful that way. And the other side of the structural argument is that homeschoolers, as we've seen, are very active and networked and perhaps in the kind of networks where people are able to know and see what is going on in the home, and perhaps are even watching a little more carefully because they're a little bit suspicious, like grandparents are a little bit suspicious of the homeschooling. So ultimately, I'm not saying that that works better than public schooling or not, but there are certainly structural arguments to be made on the other side in terms of the kind of environment that a homeschool child has that might be protective in other ways too. And finally, I think I would say it's a little ironic that we would argue that somehow public schools, their kind of reason for being is to report child abuse, when we know from a lot of work, including LaRue, that this is one reason that many lower and working class families are quite alienated from the public schools because they're very suspicious of the school authorities. So, while it may have some kind of positive effects, my guess is that any parent who is trying to cover up child abuse are very much aware that the public school teacher is somebody they need to avoid. So I don't really see how this argument can lead us anywhere close to deciding which school sector we need to close down.
All right, so that kind of leads into this whole broader question of the function of schools and schooling. Certainly one major motivation for universal education of children through the age of 16 in our country is the need to prepare the next generation of democratic citizens. The people rule in our country, so we need the students, to be able to fulfill their role as free citizens in contributing to the procedures and the institutions of self-government. So, David, what do we know about the civic values and civic activities of people who have been homeschooled?
Yeah, that's a great question. Overall, there's not a lot of difference in young adult outcomes in terms of civic involvement, volunteering. There may be a slight lower percentage of homeschoolers, net of a lot of controls, that are involved in certain kinds of civic activities. But overall, it's pretty much the same. There's no special boost for homeschooling, no special boost for public schooling. In fact, we've never seen any special boost from public schooling. So I don't quite understand the argument that public schools are somehow going to save our democracy when I can never find any public school positive effect for civic engagement or political engagement. Oh, except for there's maybe one exception, but not much. Now on the homeschool side, it's about equal for the most part, and we do see when homeschoolers families are doing homeschooling, they're quite involved in civic activities. So this is impressive, and I think it's important in terms of just the structural opportunities and the way in which civic engagement fits well with the homeschooling approach to education. And in a way that's hard for other sectors to really engage the community. So we see that coming out in the National Household Education Survey data. So that would be the one side. The other side is the kind of political values that homeschooling tends to promote. Now, one thing that they're very strong on is free expression and the defense of cultural minorities. Now, this is interesting because it probably comes out of their own experience, right? Of feeling like a cultural minority that's on stage, that's being criticized. And so they will even be quite supportive of the freedom of those who want to make speeches against religion to do that in the public square, that's a value of our democratic society. And homeschooling young adults are very supportive of this, even more than public schooling. The other thing is they vote at pretty much the same levels. They're a little bit less likely to be registered to vote, but on the whole, they're fairly active. It's not like we're seeing a lot of pullback. So I see it looks to me like there are some positive implications of homeschooling for some of the core democratic values, and I think so. We see some positive there. We don't see a lot of pullback in terms of overall civic or political engagement. It's about the same. And then we see, the way homeschooling is done involves a lot of civically engaged activities, I would say.
All right, so I'm going to move into the Q&A. Basically, of course, I've been quizzing David here, but we have a couple of excellent questions in the Zoom group chat box to get us started on the broader Q&A, and I encourage those of you watching and listening to register your questions there so that we can discuss them. First question for you, David, is how do you feel about subsidizing homeschooling families? Do you support initiatives to provide tax breaks or other government subsidies in support of homeschool families?
Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't be the expert on this, but it seems to me that many of the theorists about schooling and democracy point out that there are public effects, there are public goods that come out of what we have commonly thought of as private school sectors. Of course, Charles Glenn's work I'm thinking of here. And it seems to me that while the subsidy may not be huge, there are important public goods that come through homeschooling, and that some support from through government funding should be available for homeschooling, as well as other forms of schooling that are making a strong contribution to the public good, whether they're considered quote unquote private or public.
Right. And, you know, given that I have some familiarity with homeschooling communities and associations and such, my sense is their strong preference would be for tax breaks and tax benefits and not direct government subsidies, because of their legitimate concern that direct government subsidies would come with more regulations that are onerous and aren't grounded in the need to help and protect children. I think that the tax side is the side where most homeschool organizations and individuals would be most open to receiving some kind of support for, as David says, the public good that they are providing by delivering an education to their children that doesn't have to be subsidized through the public school system.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm going to call my own number here on this next question, which is about the impact of homeschooling on children with special needs. Because I conducted a study of this question with Albert Cheng and Sivan Tuchman. We published it in the Journal of School Choice, and a few months later I got a call from the Johns Hopkins University College of Medicine. They said, we're doing a workshop on serving students with special needs, and we want you to speak from your expertise on homeschooling and children with disabilities. And I said, well, I'm not really an expert. I mean, I published one article on it. And the guy said, well, that makes you an expert from what we can tell. It's definitely an understudied question, and a very interesting one. What we found is that about 1% of the students in a nationally representative survey were homeschool students with disabilities. And so basically the disability rate of the homeschooling population was established as 1%. But those were students who had formal IEPs, formal individual educational plans. And certainly the number of students with disabilities who are being educated at home is much higher than that, because some of these students have never entered, a public school system where they would get diagnosed and assessed in that way. The parents are just, organizing and customizing the education to serve children at home. And when we think about the customization that is available through homeschooling, it could be a very appropriate and effective mechanism for educating a child with a disability. I mean, we found, in terms of the types of disabilities, yes, the children with disabilities who are educated at home tend to have disabilities on the milder side. But one very common form of disability for kids who are educated at home is emotional disturbance. And we can understand how a child who's struggling with emotional disturbance, the familiarity of the home environment might be very comforting to that child and help facilitate their learning process, because they know where they're going to be. It's a controlled environment. Now, we've just said that a lot of times homeschooling involves getting out of the home, but still you could strike a balance between a familiar environment and these regular trips out to educate a child who has emotional disturbance. Another thing we learned from our research is that homeschooled students with disabilities typically have regular interactions with medical and psychological professionals. So parents usually do organize and customize the education of the child to include interventions by specialists that seek to address the particular challenge that the child faces. So speech and language teachers and instructors to help a student who has a speech or hearing impairment, or psychologists for a child who has emotional disturbance, physical therapists for children who have severe physical disabilities. So typically the school day would involve interactions with many professionals outside of the home as part of the homeschooling experience. So those were our main takeaways, and the big finding was that parents who are organizing the home education of their children with disabilities are very satisfied with that experience. They feel their child is getting what they need to address their special needs. And again, in many cases, elements of that education is being delivered by professionals outside of the home. So, David, any follow-up on that?
Yeah, that seems exactly right. And in the NHES study, they about 16% say that they are homeschooling because a child has some kind of special need. And that might actually be higher if you include those that see their child as gifted, and not being served by the public school. So yeah, I think that many of the homeschoolers are not, they're not just homeschooling for religious reasons. Only about 51% will even mention religion as a primary reason to homeschool. They're homeschooling for a lot of times because they feel like the public school, the private school they can afford, is not able to meet the particular needs of their child. And that's, that's part, your study is an important part of that.
Right, and I mean the contrast between the rates in your surveys and the rates in our survey just shows the difference between being formally classified as having a disability and having a disability and just not going through that more formalized process.
Yeah. And you would imagine that public schools can't really be all things to all kids. I mean, there's a lot of diversity. And of course, this is a homeschooling emphasis that, you pick the
Right.
schooling type that meets the child where they're at their particular stage in life. And a lot of times that varies across the career of the student.
So we have a technical question about your recent study, David. What was the response rate for the survey data that you're drawing from?
Yeah, the National Household Education Survey, I think they used to report about a response rate in the 70% range. But of course, these have really dived over the last few years. So I don't think they're reporting that high. I would guess that the National Household Education Survey is reporting about 50%. As far as the Cardis Education Survey that we've been doing now for 3 or 4 times here in the US, those rates, it's through knowledge networks, the GFK, and if you include those that participate, who are part of the panel, it's an internet panel, you get about 60% that will participate. If you include the fact that some people didn't accept the invitation to be part of the panel, then you would go down quite a bit. You'd probably go down to 20–25%.
Okay, and then also from the same person, do you have any data on sort of the different homeschooling models that are being used by families, and if parent satisfaction and child satisfaction with homeschooling varies based on how structured or how unstructured it is, or if a particular kind of homeschooling model was delivered?
That's a great question. I know from the National Household Education Survey that about it's like somewhere between 8 and 10% say that they homeschooled their child with no formal instruction, no formal curriculum. So it's not a high percentage that use the unlearning or the unschooling unschooling approach to education. It's fairly limited, and I don't know, I don't have data on which, how those students reacted to that. But it would be interesting to try and pull that out. Yeah, I don't think we don't have the data on it. It's a good question.
Okay, and then Michael is asking, does Bartholet's article represent a broadly held position at places like Harvard? How concerned should the homeschooling community be? My sense is, there is a group of law professors. They are organized around the idea of the rights of children and the welfare of children. And Bartholet herself, her main area of expertise is in adoption and adoption law and adoption policy, international adoptions, and such. And so, you know, a I think it's more law professors than social scientists who take these strong positions in opposition to homeschooling. Um, and but another area is in liberal political thought and political philosophy, because there's the concern about the autonomy of the individual, and about the ability of homeschool children to choose their own vision of the good life once they are adults. Now, we homeschooled a teenager, and from personal experience, I can tell you that no one was going to tell him what vision of the good life he had to embrace as an adult. He long had been a very assertive and self-confident individual in making his own life choices. But I think those are the kind of groups in academia who are concerned and critical of homeschooling, is law professors who are focused on the rights of children, which are pretty limited in our society, because children are children, and they need their wills and their conscience to be formed before they are given the full rights of adults. A second group, liberal political theorists, and a third group being like the education establishment. Many people in the education establishment are distrustful of homeschooling. They claim that parents don't have the credentials and the training to effectively educate their children. And we can understand why they're saying that, because they went through that formal professional training and feel that it makes them effective educators of children. How could parents who haven't done that be effective in doing that? So I think those are the three groups, the three academic clusters who are most critical of homeschooling. I think outside of those three groups, there's just a lot of ignorance about homeschooling. There is, and given that, there is a tendency to buy into these myths and stereotypes that we've been discussing, like that homeschool kids are isolated, that homeschool kids don't develop social skills, that the parent themselves has to deliver all of the education. None of those are true of homeschooling in general. And I think that many people in society, though, are susceptible to adopting those stereotypes, because they are really being pushed by particular groups in the academy.
Mm.
David, any follow up on that?
No, that makes sense. I think the cultural trends are towards homeschooling, towards choice, towards parental choice. So it doesn't feel to me like there's going to be a strong movement to reverse what what's been established in the States in terms of homeschooling freedoms. There could be a greater push, for some kind of basic testing and that kind of thing. But it feels to me like the direction is more in terms of supporting family choice, and that law school professors at Harvard are a bit behind the curve on some of these things.
Right. And so John wants us to return to the abuse issue, which of course, I mean, the abuse of children is just a horrific thing. You know, if we could create a world where that never happened, I would do it in a heartbeat. Um, but John asks, what is your view of Tara Westover's book? I believe it is entitled Educated. So Tara Westover is a woman who was home educated, and she was abused. She was very seriously abused in her home, and so she has published a book about both her homeschooling and the abuse that took place in her home, and how damaging that was to her psychologically. I haven't read the book, but the book features very prominently in Professor Bartholet's law review article. Of course, we hope that this is an extreme case, and there aren't many reported cases of child abuse among home educated kids, but this is a very famous one because she published a book about it, and because she relates this horrible abuse that took place there. But it does get, it gets to the point that David made earlier about parental child abuse is parental child abuse. And even my understanding is, even in the book, at times Westover speaks well about the home education part of her experience, that isn't really what damaged her, was the abuse, and that to some extent she could separate the two, and express some appreciation for the value of the home education she received, even though it took place in an abusive home.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I would think, okay, what can you do with the case of one? Well, I mean, you can develop some theories about how the structure of homeschooling makes child abuse more likely, but that's about all you can do. I mean, we could write a lot of other books about people in other sectors that had a similar situation, and maybe other dynamics were at play, but they had the same result, a horrific result. So to me, if you're going to develop a theoretical case out of this particular understanding, it seems to me it doesn't hold up. That the structures of homeschooling don't actually create the kind of environment that generally that was created there in that one case. That's the way it seems to me. I don't know what else to do with an anecdote in terms of trying to decide school policy.
Right. I mean, there's a saying that extreme cases make bad law, and I think we like to think as social scientists that outlier cases, make for bad generalization, and this is an extreme outlier case, and it's a tragedy. But I would certainly hesitate to make a big leap from that one case to wholesale regulation of homeschooling. So a quick follow-up question about my three sources, my three clusters in the academy who are critical of homeschooling. They are the education establishment. So some teachers colleges are very critical of homeschooling. Law professors who are focused on the rights of children, and then political philosophers, modern political theorists and philosophers who are in the liberal tradition, the classical liberal and modern liberal tradition of political philosophy, who feel that young people need to be prepared to choose a vision, their own vision of the good life, not necessarily the vision of the good life that their parents inculcated in them. That's a third group, and they kind of overlap with the law professors. And you see that Elizabeth Bartholet and other law professors who criticize homeschooling often cite these political theorists, liberal political theorists like Amy Gutman and Steve Macedo, who make these strong arguments about us preparing young people, to choose their own way and choose their own vision of the good life.